Hello everybody. Geez, I guess we're sort of coming to an end of this thing. Today is the last of the videotape lectures that will be placed on YouTube. And, well, what to say at this point? It's been a strange way to teach a course. And I must say that I've missed seeing all of you in class. It's much, much better to be in a group all together. But we do what we need to do, and we've accommodated ourselves to our changed circumstance. As I'm recording this, it is Sunday, around noon, 19th of April. So we're heading into our last week of class. And before I get into the substance of today's topic, just a couple of announcements. First of all, your final papers are due on Friday. You need to send them to me via email as a Word attachment, and then I'll respond with an email to tell you that I've received them. And I'll get onto those very quickly, actually. You can send them any time of the day on Friday. Don't worry about the normal, 10:30 to 11:45 class meeting time. Just get them in sometime during the day. As long as it's in before midnight, I'm good with it at that point as far as time of submission. Also on Friday, I will make available to you, both on Blackboard and probably also via email, your final examination. And what you want to do with that is, as soon as you feel like you're ready to take it, go ahead and take it. I'll give you detailed instructions about actually taking the exam. And once you finish it, obviously you're going to be typing it out. You're going to be word processing it. Submit it to me via email as a Word attachment. And that one you need to get to me by 5 p.m. on Monday, the 27th of April. If we were actually on campus and doing the classroom in-class exam, that's when your exam would be due. And the university does want us to sort of adhere to that in terms of making these submissions, because they don't want finals week to get all crazy for people. And it's better if we sort of maintain some sort of order as far as time. And so in this course, because of the luck of the draw, we're getting everything done very quickly this semester, which is fine. I'll let you get on to other things. Once everything is wound down, probably sometime in the next couple of days, I may actually put up another very brief sort of wind up the course video just to say goodbye and that sort of thing, and discuss any other loose ends. But anyway, that's pretty much it. As you can see, I'm once again sitting in the backyard. You can hear a dog barking in the background. It's not ours, and I have to say, you may have noticed this yourself, depending upon what part of the country you're living in. But we've had this sort of strange seclusion we've placed ourselves in. The one kind of up thing about it is that because of the mild winter and an abundance of precipitation at the right time, it's been actually a very beautiful early spring. Just to give you a sense of it, we have all these roses in the back here, and I think I've already mentioned wisteria in the back of the garden, and our Japanese maples looking great, and all the other roses are coming out. And so for whatever it's worth, we get that kind of consolation. Actually, Professor Drell came out a little earlier today and cut some roses and set them on a vase inside. And so the world remains a beautiful place regardless of the circumstance, and enjoy these things that you can. It is actually a very verdant and lovely year. And it's a really nice spring day today. And having said that, talking about nature and peace, let's talk about war and violence a little bit. Our final topic in the syllabus is the 100 Years' War, this pan-European conflict, which is one of these factors during the late Middle Ages from 1300 to 1500 that's part and parcel of fraying out of old medieval institutions and making way for something different. We've already discussed that a bit in terms of demographics in the economy when we talked about the Great Famine and Black Death. And if we had all the time in the world, we would have talked more about the church during the late medieval period, because it goes through its own series of crises. This other interlocking crisis is this conflict between England and France that ultimately involves not just England and France, but some other European powers as well. This entire large conflict has been called the 100 Years' War, which is somewhat of a misnomer. It's misleading in a couple of respects. First of all, it's not something that just broke out immediately and they decided to fight for 100 years. The conflict was actually rooted in tensions between England and France that preceded the actual outbreak of the war by a couple of centuries. Actually, it's a number of factors we've talked about before, and they'll just rear their heads again at this point. And it wasn't a continuous conflict over a century. It was a collection of military incidents that were separated by long periods of peace or minor skirmishes. And so it's not like the English and the French are engaging in this century-long war of attrition where there's constant conflict. It's nothing like that at all. And actually, even if you look at the dating of it, the beginning of it's dated to 1337 and the end of it to 1453, and that's not 100 years, that's more than 100 years, which again tells you that the name is a little bit misleading. But as a conflict, as a complex conflict, actually, it had origins, and we can talk about that a bit. Actually, I should encourage you, since I forgot to do it at the very beginning, go to Blackboard and download the outline. There's also a study guide available to you on Blackboard on the topic. And if I get around to it, maybe I'll put up a map. And I don't think we'll need a genealogy, but I'll check around. And if there's a decent one to put up, I'll put up for you. But I think I can more or less explain this to you without it, as long as you listen very carefully and follow the outline as we're talking about this. In terms of the origins of the conflict, part of it has to do with issues of vassalage and dynastic politics. This sort of odd relationship between the English and French crowns. And you already sort of know what I'm talking about. That from the time of William the Conqueror onward, the King of England set in this unusual relationship with the King of France. He was technically a vassal because the King of England held territories in France. And it doesn't mean in an absolute sense that the King of France was ordering the King of England around. It didn't really work that way in terms of power dynamics most of the time. But it becomes a significant factor. And obviously the origins of this is the fact that when William conquered England in 1066, he was already Duke of Normandy, and he held that as a fief, as a feudal holding, and there we are using the F word again, even though we try not to, of the King of France. And this is something that became even more magnified with the creation of the Angevin Empire by means of review. When we're talking about Henry II, he becomes King of England, but his father, Geoffrey, had been Count of Anjou, and so he inherits that. And Geoffrey had actually conquered Normandy, and so that also comes to him through Geoffrey. And as you already know, and it's a huge factor for Henry II, he married well in terms of territory. His marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine gave him a claim to Aquitaine, and you've seen the maps, you remember the maps, where you have a situation where the King of England is actually the lord of more of France directly than the King of France is. And so you have this power imbalance between the two in a very complex sort of relationship that the French kings are always pushing back against in various ways. So you have the creation of this Angevin Empire, and then it's more or less lost with John, as you recall. And by his successors, there were attempts at recovery. Henry III tried to get some of it back, but he was fairly unsuccessful. And if you remember, as a result of the Treaty of Paris, where he cut this deal with the King of France to try to undercut the rebellion against him in England, he ends up with only part of Aquitaine, the Gascon coast, at the very end of it. And so this big territory that the kings of England once held, it's reduced to a fairly narrow sliver of land in the southwestern corner of France, and which includes the city of Bordeaux. And that's a city that continues to have very strong connections with the English crown. It's a city through which they would get a lot of their supply of wine because Gascony is a very rich wine-producing region. Now, in terms of solidifying this small claim to what they did hold, Edward I becomes significant here. He married this woman named Eleanor of Castile, and as her dowry, she came with an area called Ponthieu, which is added to these territories that the English held. But the larger point is that Angevin Empire had been shrunk down. It wasn't anywhere nearly as significant as it once was. And the French kings were determined to regain even this eventually, to place it more directly under French control. Now, in terms of the dynastic roots of the war, it has to do quite a bit with what's going on in the French royal house, and we haven't talked about them that much recently in the course. But I'm just going to give you a few names and very briefly explain the situation. You have a very powerful late medieval French king, Philip IV, Philip the Fair, actually. And if you were taking a general course on the late Middle Ages, he would pop up in various contexts. Here he's going to come up in the case of a dynastic issue. So he rules from around 1285 to around 1314. He has a good long reign, nearly 30 years. And then he has three sons, Louis X, Philip V, Charles IV. The reason why we mention them here, it's kind of a dynastic mathematical issue. Philip had a long reign, but on your overhead, on your outline, you want to look at the length of the reigns of these three. And what you'll discover is they were quite brief. Louis X just for a couple of years, Philip V for about 6 years, Charles for about 6 years. And the issue then is, as these guys die relatively young as kings, not a one of them produces a male heir. And so you run into a real dynastic problem. And this is where the situation gets ensnared with the kings of England. Because these three short-lived kings, they also had a sister. And the sister you already know. You've encountered her in another context. It's Isabel. Thanks, Sophie Marceau in Braveheart, the woman who was married to Edward II. And basically, as you know, well, they were married in 1308, and the effort behind that marriage was to sort of diffuse tensions between England and France, to turn the volume down a little bit. But ultimately, it didn't work out that way. They produced a son, Edward III, and you had that silliness in Braveheart where they were trying to imply that Edward III might be the son of William Wallace and Isabel. That's nonsense, of course. Now, they do produce a son who becomes Edward III, a very long-lived and powerful medieval English king, ruled from 1327 until 1377. And basically, the question then is, if the King of France dies without an heir, where do you go to locate the next King of France? And what the French did is they backed up into the genealogy and went through a collateral line. What I mean by that is that the late Philip IV, the father of these three short-lived kings, he had a brother. He had a couple of younger brothers, actually, at least. And the one that they settle on for a collateral line is this guy named Charles, Count of Valois. Charles is dead by the point that you need an heir, but he had a son named Philip. And what the French then decide to do is make him the king. And so you basically have a shift of dynasty at this point. You go from the last of the Capetian kings into the first of the Valois line. Despite this, Edward felt he had a legitimate claim, the young Edward III, to become king of France. And we should also note that Edward was a very kingly king, as we had mentioned when we were talking about Braveheart and those other issues. Edward I, the Longshanks, was a very capable military and political leader. There were more problems under Edward II. There were some issues there. He was considered somewhat of an unkingly king. And then when you look at Edward III, he's kind of a throwback to his grandfather. This was a guy that had very strong ambitions in terms of acquiring glory for himself militarily. And he actually liked the idea that he was kind of a reincarnation of King Arthur. What he does once he's an adult and is able to rule on his own, he founded something called the Order of the Garter, which was a knightly order, a chivalric order, to emulate Arthur's Knights of the Round Table. And so that was part of his self-perception, the way he conceived of himself, thought about himself. And he had a great desire to go out and prove himself as a warrior. And so this is going to be an aggressive, warlike king, and he's also very competent as a warrior. He engaged in some activities in Scotland, because you can always go up and, I guess, beat up on the Scots, I suppose. But France for him was a more attractive enemy, something more worthy of his mettle, where he could demonstrate his chivalric and military values. The way that the French actually, as a legal matter, kept him from becoming named king is they looked back into old French laws to find a justification for excluding him. And what they settled upon was the Law of the Salient Franks, a law code that had been promulgated about a millennium earlier. If you were taking early Middle Ages course, this would come up. Actually, the Salic Law is something I frequently assign in classes. I've taught early Middle Ages quite a few times over the years, and it's kind of a staple in the course. There is a codicil in the Salic Law, the Law of the Salient Franks, that says that no inheritance can pass through the female line. And so the French attorneys gave that to the French royal house as a way of excluding Edward, because his claim would have been through Isabel, through a female line, and not through a male line. Actually, in the Shakespeare play Henry V, of which I'm hoping you'll take a look at the movie version of it, starring Kenneth Branagh, they refer to this. It's referred to in the play and also in the version of the play that you see in the movie, where the French are trying to justify the exclusion of Edward III from inheriting the kingdom, basically. So that's how they sort of work that. Now, so you have this dynastic issue, sort of an outstanding thing, where they create a different line of kings. You have an English king who thinks he has a better claim than Philip of Valois, the person who's ultimately named king. Now, beyond these issues of vassalage and dynasty, you also have a particular sort of, how best to put it, dynamic going on in France, as good as any, where the conflict for the French assumes a very particular form. And the way I put it in your outline is that you have king, count, duke, French particularism. What I mean by this is that there's a lot of internal dissension in France at the time, which contributes materially to the way the war plays itself out. Basically, to go back in time again, you recall that you have this situation where the King of France controls directly only a fairly small amount of territory in France, this area called the Ile-de-France. And he's surrounded by very powerful French nobles, and he's also surrounded a good part of the time by an English king who is his nominal vassal but controls a lot of these counties and duchies in France. And so what the French monarchs have been doing during the course of the 12th and 13th centuries is they're trying to establish effective control over these counts and dukes. And that includes the King of England as a count or a duke of the King of France. And what this means is that, think about it in these terms, all of these major nobles, whether it's a count or a duke, they like to retain as much of their own independence and autonomy as possible. Obviously, they are vassals of the French king, but it doesn't mean that they can't try to carve out as much authority for themselves as they can. And so once the war, or it becomes apparent that a war is going to break out, then does break out, many French overlords favored the claim of Edward over the actual King of France, Philip, because they felt that Edward, as a more distant power, would encroach less on their own autonomy. And so for them, it seemed like a pretty good idea. The best example of this was the Duke of Burgundy, who tended to favor the King of England for most of the war, until he decided not to favor the King of England in the latter phases of the war. And the Duke of Burgundy is a very powerful French noble, controls a large territory. The English also had a very significant wool trade with Flanders. In Flanders, you have almost industrial scale, actually I will say by medieval standards, industrial scale wool and cloth production. But they don't provide most of their own wool. They have some domestic wool produced, but they get the vast majority of it from England, which produces huge quantities of wool. And so you have this sort of symbiotic relationship between the English wool merchants and the Flemish textile producers. And what this means is that because of this, the English want to really detach Flanders from the rest of France if they can. And so Flanders becomes an issue. If you look at Flanders itself, the Flemish aristocracy favor the French king, but the Flemish merchants and cloth manufacturers favor the English because of their economic tie, which again leads to sort of a dynamic, almost like civil war in France because of these divisions. And that's the character that the war assumes for the French. It's not just all people who might be considered French fighting against the English. There's this internal dissension politically in France, which complicates the dynamic of the war. And also, to make the war a little bit more international, the French appeal to kings and nobles outside of France on the continent for assistance, people like the Holy Roman Empire. And, you have these mercenaries down in Italy you can sometimes frequently use in warfare. They can appeal to the Swiss, they can appeal to various people. And so other countries, other groups of people become involved in the war over the course of time. And so it becomes not just an Anglo-French conflict, it has more broader general European overtones as it goes on. And so that's sort of the circumstance that's there. You have first the dynastic and feudal issues, then you have this internal issue in France. Now, what set it off? What brought the English and French to direct blows where you can think that now there's a war going on? and a war that eventually ends up in various ways lasting a long time. Well, the immediate cause is interesting because when Philip VI assumed the throne in 1328, Edward didn't object immediately. He didn't say much of anything about it. In fact, he did homage to Philip for the fief of Gascony. He actually behaves like a good F-word vassal, feudal vassal. And it's also clear that as Philip assumes the throne, he's determined to regain Gascony, to detach it from English control. What allows him to try to recover it? Well, you have some Gascon nobles that don't like necessarily in every instance the way the English are treating them, and they appeal to Philip as the King of England's overlord. And Philip claims that even though Edward had done his homage to him, he had done inadequate homage. And this will require just a slight explanation since we didn't do the F word in any explicit way in class. What Philip claimed is that Edward had done simple homage as opposed to liege homage. What's the difference? Well, if you study the way these relationships are set up in the Middle Ages between lords and vassals, and this may have even become clear in class at some point, you will often see knights or minor lords, sometimes major lords, acquiring multiple fiefs in multiple relationships with multiple lords. In other words, you wouldn't be just the vassal of a single lord, but you would accumulate a bigger property by swearing homage to another, to maybe two or three more, and sometimes even more than that. And of course, this becomes complicated. Say, for instance, you're Joe Knight, and you have sworn homage to both Lord A and Lord B. Lord A and Lord B don't like each other, and they engage in a war, and they both call you up to do your military service. Well, which lord do you support then? The way that this was resolved is by creating this thing called liege homage. And the idea here is that, yeah, you can, have a loyalty to multiple lords, but there's always one who's more important than the other one, and other ones. And if it comes down to these guys coming to blows, you support the person to whom you have sworn liege homage. And so what Philip was claiming is that Edward hadn't done this for him, and he needed to do it. Therefore, if he doesn't do the right sort of homage, Philip thinks that he can then seize Edward's fief, which would be the entirety of Gascony. Edward refused to do homage. Philip declared Gascony forfeit in 1337. And so 9 years into his kingship, that's when the problem actually occurs, because he takes action against Edward. By this time, by 1337, it's clear that Edward III had maybe changed his mind about his claim to the French throne. He hadn't asserted it in 1328, but now he's going to assert it. He declares war, and he made public his intention to assume the throne in that year. It's an interesting thing. If you look at charters for Edward III, from 1337 onward, they're dated by two sets of regnal years. The first set is the first number you would see is the year in his reign as King of England. And then from 1337 onward, they would also add the year of his reign as King of France, because he considers himself by this point to be King of France, even though he doesn't own it. He doesn't have it at that point, but it's signaling his intention. And this was something that you see through the rest of his reign, this sort of double regnal year thing in many of his official documents. Edward's claim caused Philip some problems because it was always difficult for Philip to discipline his vassals. The French king, that kingdom is not anywhere nearly as centralized as the Kingdom of England. And so he always has this turbulence to deal with. And if he causes them individually too much trouble, they could threaten to repudiate him and honor Edward's claim to the throne. And this is another part of that dynamic where for the French, it becomes something almost like a civil war, in addition to having this external person causing you issues. And of course, the question is often asked, having gone through this, and I've given you a very stripped down basic explanation of it, but the question is often asked, is this even too simple an explanation? People are always wondering, why didn't Edward assert his claim earlier? Why did he wait until 1337 to do it? Did he have ulterior motives? Is there something else here that's a little less obvious that could have been driving him? And can the causes of this war be understood only in relation to Anglo-French relations, or is it a more broader European scale on which you have to think if you want to understand it. Well, I'll leave that to you guys. Obviously, if you become interested in the 100 Years' War, there have been a raft of books written about it, various accounts of it from both French and English perspectives. If you want to read the longest systematic account of it, there's a man named Jonathan Sumption who's been doing this multi-volume history of the 100 Years' War, which is probably the definitive thing out there now. And like I said, I'm giving this to you in basically a single lecture. It's something you can spend a ton of time on from any number of perspectives. Now, so you have this, this is your casus belli, this claim, war is declared in 1337. And before we get into the actual nuts and bolts of the conflict, as it is, how best to put it, negotiated is not the right word, but as it's actually done, performed, we want to say just a little bit about military tactics and strategy, just very briefly. One thing to say about it, and most people would concede this, is that the 100 Years' War represents the last gasp of traditional feudal warfare. And again, the F word. We just can't seem to help ourselves. But as you already know, that when you think about warfare in the Middle Ages, particularly the high and late Middle Ages, it is modeled on the use of heavily mounted cavalry. That's how William won at Hastings. It's what he won with these heavily mounted knights. And associated with this system, there's this appearance of this chivalric code, this sort of set of manners and customs by which people engaged in warfare as knights, that there was a sense of a type of honor, and that war was an honorable activity among gentlemen. So you had some rules. And if you think about it, you can probably come up with some examples of honorable chivalric behavior. These values persist into the 100 Years' War, and actually I'm going to give you a couple of extreme examples as we move on of warriors, even in the context of warfare changing, still inculcated with these values and expressing them in various ways. But as this war goes on, it has already begun to occur, and certainly is nearing a type of completion by the end of the war, is that these feudal levies, where the king calls out all the knights, they're being replaced by hired armies, that you're moving gradually to a professionalized type military, which is a very different thing from these feudal levies. And it's part of the reason why the late Middle Ages is sort of this meat grinder that begins to move you away from the medieval way of doing things and into early modernity. Things that for us would be a little bit more recognizable, things that we can get our heads around a bit more easily. Monarchs generally came to prefer hired armies, and the reason for this is that feudal levies are more difficult to control when you call the knights up, because you have this tendency for the knights to pursue independent agendas when they get the opportunity to do it. They're not the most disciplined forces in the world. And you also had this other problem with the feudal levies. They only served for a limited part of the year. The basic rule, and there are a lot of variations on this, but if we had done the quote-unquote feudalism thing, what I would have explained to you, and I think I may even have alluded to it in class, is that if a lord calls a knight up, if he summons his vassal to go out on a military expedition, there was a limit on the number of days that he could be held in service. In most instances, there are variations, but most instances there's this sort of 40-day rule that basically you can call up your vassal and he will go out and fight with you for 40 days at the vassal's expense. If you keep him out longer than that, then you as the lord have to support him, and he's not necessarily obliged to do it even at that point. In some instances, there are also distinctions made between offensive and defensive sorts of situations, where in terms of a lord needing these guys to defend him, he can have them out pretty much as long as he wants. But if he's going on an offensive mission, then there are absolute limitations in terms of duration of service. And what this meant is that since these limits were there, it became more and more evident to monarchs that the hired army is a better deal, because you can keep those guys out as long as you need them, as long as you can pay them, basically. And they're a little easier to discipline because they are hired, basically. They're professionalized in some fashion. So you have that as a factor. There's also another and very important factor in terms of how the specific battles in the 100 Years' War worked themselves out. And the way I put it here is that during this war, you have the rise of the English yeoman, who was a bowman, basically. War became more little d democratic during the 100 Years' War. Basically, you have a fundamental change in projectile warfare as it was conducted during the war. The English, when they were fighting the Welsh, we talked about that earlier in the semester, that's when they came into close contact with this thing called the longbow. And the longbow was precisely that. It is this very long, tall bow, very powerful. And the reason, when we think about medieval warfare, we often think about crossbows, and they were certainly used during this period. But the thing about the longbow is that it's faster to load. It's as quick. It's as quick as you can notch an arrow on the string, pull it back, aim it, release it. Whereas with the crossbow, once you fired a bolt, you have to stick another bolt in and then wind the mechanism back to get this adequate sort of tension on the line to then shoot it. It's also more powerful than the crossbow. That within a reasonable distance, the longbow is armor piercing. You can skewer a knight with it, which makes a huge difference. And if a bowman's good, it can also be fairly deadly accurate, if need be, a reasonable distance. The thing is that this longbow became the determining factor in set battles in most instances during the 100 Years' War. Basically what the English would do is they would place the army in a defensive position and flank it with companies of bowmen. And if the enemy charged the English lines, the longbowmen could then basically mow them down, turn them into pincushions by loosing just lots and lots of arrows. Actually, you saw a little bit of this in Braveheart, and as we mentioned, one of the really inaccurate bits of Braveheart is that bit about the Irish changing sides. And we mentioned that there was the basis for it was some balkiness among Welsh bowmen, actually, at that battle where that's depicted. So you can see where all these connections begin to come together in a way. What it means also is that since this becomes a decisive factor in set battles, it's the rank and file, the large number of bowmen that become more important than the mounted feudal thugs in the outcome of these things. And so you're fundamentally changing the nature of warfare. It's where the large mass of soldiers make the most difference, and and you have bigger armies with these large masses of soldiers, and you have more participation by a broader segment of society, of English society, as they're using these people in this war, this new type of warfare. Basically what happens is that gradually the feudal aristocracy is deprived of its chief function. And to make matters even a little worse for this aristocratic feudal model of warfare, as the war goes on, you begin to see the appearance of firearms, gunpowder-powered weapons, and both in terms of small firearms and also large artillery during the course of the war, particularly the latter phases of it, where you can get very large cannons, you can fire at castle walls and begin to blow the walls down. And so you see things changing. Now, another aspect of this, however, is that for most of the 100 Years' War, the vast majority of it, you would consider it a war that was conducted in a low-intensity way. It was low-intensity warfare. Well, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that in terms of big battles, set battles, where you have two armies, national armies facing off against each other, there was only a handful of these during the entire duration of the war, where you have these big decisive battles where they're just going to fight and hack it out. The primary activity was something called the chevauchée. And what the chevauchée was, it was raiding of the countryside by the English, where they go over to France and they would roam around and, tear stuff up, steal stuff. When they could, the English would try to capture French knights on these chevauchées. And the reason for that is probably something you can already guess if you think about it for a minute. Because if you capture a knight, there is a feudal obligation that his subordinates ransom him. And what the English discovered is if you could capture some high quality French knights and drag them back to England, you can actually sort of hold them up for ransom and do pretty well at it to make some beau coups of bucks out of it. And so a lot of these English knights on these chevauchés, they would do whatever they could to capture knights and take them home and collect them and then ransom them later. And so you have all these changing dynamics during the course of the war. The larger dynamic is the old way of doing warfare where the mounted knight made all the difference. That's fading during the course of the war. And so we get to the war itself. And, I'll try to describe these things as well as I can. As I've already said, the political military thing isn't my best thing by a long shot, but we'll try to make this as coherent as we can. So you can divide the war into phases. I'm going to do a 14th century phase and then a 15th century phase and mention the major battles and the major developments within each of them. So you just sort of get a sense of the story. As I've already noted, this war is a complex thing, and I'm giving you a very bastardized version of it. And like I said, I would encourage you people who are interested in these military things to go to the big books. You can get some wonderful narratives of it. And if you do it, I do encourage you to maybe look at both accounts by French and English authors to see the different perspectives. This thing by Edouard Perroy called The 100 Years' War, which gives you a French perspective. And you have a fair number of English-speaking writers who've written on it as well at great length. In terms of the 14th century phase, the first bit of it, for about the first 9 years, from 1337 until 1346, you have raids and a series of truces. Basically, what became apparent almost immediately to Edward is that it's difficult to finance a big foreign war like this, where you're going to take major troops over and cause problems. Edward III, he made appeals to the Flemish allies for help. And in fact, he made an abortive attempt in 1338 to invade Flanders. It didn't work. Nothing came of it. And at the same time, you have Norman fleets making coastal raids on England, and this is how the English suffered to the degree that they suffered during the war. There was a fair amount of coastal raiding in the early phases of it. In terms of easing Edward's ability to get across the Channel to France to engage in the war, the crucial event occurs in 1340, where there's a big naval battle, major one, between the English and the French at Sluys, and the English win that. They win it quite resoundingly. And after this, basically, they have the Channel fairly much open for them to go and do what they want to do. But in the short term, they do nothing but a series of raids to loot French territory. And so you have these chevauchés going on once they've established a type of control in the Channel. You only get a major battle in 1346. And it's the same known as the Battle of Crécy, and we'll give you the whys and wherefores of how this came to occur. Basically, Edward does engage in a bit of a campaign in France. His idea with this campaign in 1346 was to relieve Gascony from pressure by the French. That was what he wanted to do, but as he begins to take the fleet over, poor weather forced the fleet to the coast of Cornwall, to the western part of England. And while they're waiting there for the weather to get better, he was persuaded to divert the campaign to Normandy to engage in chevauchés to plunder, essentially, since it wasn't going to be that easy for him to get to Gascony. And so they start doing that. They go to Normandy, they start plundering, they're having a great time, just tearing up stuff to take home. Philip VI was determined to retaliate for this. Obviously he wasn't thrilled. But in terms of Edward, his ultimate intention actually was to go back to England, and the way he wanted to do it is he wanted to get himself north up to Flanders. He could then head back through there, arrange passage, essentially through Flanders. So he raids for a while in Normandy. He's trying to head to Flanders, but his progress was slowed because Philip began to destroy the bridges and to safeguard other bridges over the Seine and Somme rivers, which made it very difficult for Edward to cross his troops over to try to get to Flanders to make his way back. Basically, a peasant at one point showed Edward III's army the last usable ford across the Somme, so they crossed the river. But by this point, their army was tired. They were running short of food. When you're in a foreign country and you're out on your own, you begin to have logistical issues. And it reached a point where it was clear they weren't going to be able to reach Flanders, and so they had no real choice but to fight. This raiding party that he had brought over had about 9,000 men, and it was clear to Edward they were going to be greatly outnumbered by the French, who had the home court advantage here. So Edward and the third and his advisors, they decide that they have to make a very careful choice of ground to defend themselves. They choose some high ground near this little town named Crécy. And, you know, what becomes apparent to a degree that people understand what happened at Crécy, and no one really completely understands what happened in the battle. You have various accounts, and none of it fits together perfectly according to military history buffs, which I freely admit I am not, but this seems to be the consensus regarding it. But what seemed to be the biggest problem is that Philip had a lack of command and control. In other words, the English were fairly disciplined in what they did to defend themselves, but the French were not disciplined in their arrival and in what they did when they got there. Basically, in terms of the early parts of it, the French have some Genoese archers, archers from Italy, which again gives you this sort of international thing. They try to fire uphill into the sun at the English, and they're decimated by the English longbowmen who are shooting downhill at them. And so the archers are largely taken out. The ones that aren't killed, engage in a very disorderly retreat. And it's at this juncture that the English knights run them down. And so this is where the two types of English forces are cooperating. The problem for the French forces, the rest of their army, as opposed to these archers, is that they arrive piecemeal. They didn't make it to the battle all at once. And what basically happened as they arrived, just a few at a time, is that the English bowmen turn them into pincushions. They just decimate them. And they decimate effectively the French nobility at this point. A lot of French nobles die at Crécy because they're arriving just a few at a time. Philip VI sees what's happening, and he escapes with a handful of followers. Basically, he bugs out to save himself and a few of his close pals, and there's a great slaughter. And so this outnumbered English army, because apparently lack of discipline amongst the French troops and Philip's inability to control them well, they quite improbably win this battle. And it leads to a great military reputation, the building of it, for Edward III and also his son Edward the Black Prince. And you probably have heard that title before. He was there at the Battle of Crécy as well. And they both, basically, their reps go way up as a consequence of this, where an outnumbered, tired army manages to defeat the flower of French chivalry at Crécy. Having done this, having won the battle, Edward then, he had a desire. He wanted a port to end the need to enter France through either the Flemish ports or through Gascony. And he wants to have a base from which to control piracy in the Channel. And so he wants a port that the English would control to allow them easy ingress and egress from France. What he settles on is the town of Calais in northern France. And this makes perfect sense, and some of you probably already know why, because Calais looks straight across at the English port city of Dover. It's the shortest crossing between England and France across the English Channel. I think I did mention in class, my wife and I visited Dover a number of years back. I think it was actually the summer of 2015. And we were up on the cliffs in Dover, and it is in fact true, on a nice clear day, and it was clear, you can see all the way over to Calais. Actually back, a younger version of me back in the early 90s actually decided to take land transportation all the way from where I was at in England. I was in Bury St. Edmunds at the time, and to travel down to visit Professor Drell, who was not Professor Drell. We were still in graduate school then. It was the year before we got married. When we were both in Europe for the year. And part of that trip, I took the train, a train obviously from Bury to London, grabbed another train from London to Dover, and then ended up taking the Channel Ferry across from Dover to Calais, which is the best way to do it in terms of just being fun. You're out in this gigantic boat, and you arrive in France after 45 minutes or so, however long it takes to cross. But the point is, he settled on Calais. It makes perfect sense to have a port there. And he decided, rather than attacking the city, and trying to besiege it in that way, he set up a blockade, which lasted for about a year, and it didn't go as quickly as he would have hoped. The city does eventually surrender, but he's still so angry that it took so long and sucked up so many resources. He was at one point determined to kill some of the burghers of Calais, ugly public executions, and just slaughter everybody. He's somewhat talked out of this by his queen, but what you do have, well, actually, the reason why I mention this is that if you go to the campus on Stanford, at Stanford University in Palo Alto, which I go fairly frequently because that's where Professor Drell grew up. She was a Stanford faculty brat, grew up on campus practically. If you go to the Memorial Church, the big sort of corporate image for Stanford, in one of the exterior courtyards, you see these Rodin sculptures called the Burghers of Calais, and it depicts these poor men who are under this grave threat from Edward, and they're depicted being basically in shackles. It's a very sort of striking, very emotive sort of presentation by the famous French sculptor Rodin. And so if you're at Stanford, take a look at it. It refers to this event in the wake of the Siege of Calais. Basically, what Edward eventually did is he, in the short term, ejected most of Calais' residents, but many later returned. And he brought a bunch of English immigrants to help populate the city. And so you end up having this very mixed French-English population in Calais, but it becomes this port that the English can use to cross very easily, bring troops over whenever they want between England and France. And so at this point, you've had your first major battle, the Battle of Crécy, and Edward is 1-0. The English are 1-0 if you're going to keep score on this, which leads us, of course, into the second major battle 10 years later, the Battle of Poitiers. The person involved in this actually is not Edward III, it is his son, Edward the Black Prince. And for those of you who've seen the film, you already have kind of a cinematic mental image of him. Think the English actor James Purefoy, because he appears as Edward the Black Prince in that very trippy, kind of fun movie called A Knight's Tale, the thing with Heath Ledger in it, the late Heath Ledger, where he plays a knight, a peasant who's trying to become a knight, and he competes in tournaments. And at a couple of very important junctures in the story, you have Edward the Black Prince appear, as played by James Purefoy. He seems kind of sort of like a hang-dog character because he wants to actually go to these tournaments and compete in these tournaments, but because he's the king, no one wants to. Because you don't want to fight with the king, or not with the king, but with the prince, with royalty. And so this is Edward the Black Prince who's involved in the deal at Poitiers. Basically what Edward did, Edward III, he made the Black Prince the Sergeant of Gascony, his representative there, in that territory that the English controlled. And so in 1355, the Black Prince began a lucrative raiding expedition through southern France. And the raiding continued into 1356. So he goes on this long-term raid. He eventually gets up to the Loire Valley, and he plunders it thoroughly to the point that he has a raiding army followed by many, many loot wagons of all the stuff that they've stolen from all these villages that they've looted. His probable intention then was to try to get back to Bordeaux, the base in Gascony, and return home. But the French king, at this point, it's a guy named John II, John the Good. He had assembled an army at Chartres, and so you have these two armies that are out in the field, and neither was certain of the other's location. Obviously, in a general sense, John knew that that Edward was out there, and Edward knew that John had assembled an army. And what happens essentially is the Black Prince's army bumps into scouts from John II's army, and they capture these scouts. And the Black Prince then realizes, once he's done this, that his path of retreat to Bordeaux was blocked by John's army, that he wouldn't be able to get back, and he had no alternative but to fight. And so much as at Crécy, this was a battle that the English never intended to fight. They were looking to get out of the country, basically, having done what they wanted to do. But again, they're compelled to fight. And strange thing, the Black Prince used essentially the same tactics that Edward III had used at Crécy, with his archers in the front and dismounted knights in the rear. And there was an effort at Poitiers by a small band of French knights to break the English line. They were mowed down by the English archers. So you see a repetition of some of the stuff that was going on at Crécy. John II gave an ill-considered order for all of his knights to dismount. Basically, this wasn't helpful to the French because they didn't have anything equivalent to the English archers. And what happened in the second part of the battle is that the division led by the Crown Prince of Dauphin fought well but was overwhelmed. The second division of the French army, led by the Duke of Orleans, broke and ran. They just scrambled off the battlefield. The third division of the French army was led by John II himself, and he felt, since he was inculcated up to his eyeballs in chivalric virtue, that he had to show his valence, his virtue, in battle. He rushed into battle and was personally captured by the English. And so the English king has been captured by Edward the Black Prince's army. And it's just kind of a repeat of Crécy, where now the English are 2-0. And at the end of the battle, a 2-year truce was arranged. The Black Prince accompanied his royal captive honorably to London because they're engaging in chivalric behavior now. You take your vanquished enemy and you treat him well. It was a disaster for France because the king is now in England, and you have a 19-year Dauphin who had to cope with the consequences of the loss. Basically, in terms of negotiations, having physical possession of John II, as well as his youngest son, they captured him too, gave Edward III a great advantage. And what they eventually hammer out in 1360 is this thing called the Treaty of Bretigny. The treaty, well, let's think about it this way. You have captured a king, and this king's vassals are required to ransom him to get him back. How much can you ask? Well, what they asked for was 3 million crowns. Now, think about medieval money. When we talk about pounds as opposed to crowns, when we're talking about English money during the period, when we're talking about 10, 20, 30,000, up to 100,000, this is huge money. Well, this is 3 million French crowns. So think about it in those terms. That was a sum that was probably never going to be paid because it was exorbitant and outrageous, but the French had no choice but to agree to it. And the English do try to enforce payment of parts of it over time. In addition to this, they give up some territory, the French do. They give up the Duchy of Aquitaine. They give up the counties of Ponthieu, Montreux, Guienne in the north, and areas around Calais. And so they make a territorial concession to the English. And so the English are beginning to acquire territory in France again as a result of the Battle of Poitiers. The ransom was supposed to be paid in installments. And when the first installment was paid, they released John. But there was a surrendering at this point of 3 of his sons as hostages to ensure his good behavior and to ensure that the later installments of the ransom would be paid. And then the strangest damn thing happens. One of his sons doesn't like being under house arrest, and he breaks loose and he flees. And this is where these chivalric values come into play. John, who is back in France, he views this, of course, as a dishonorable act. A knight does not break his honorable confinement. And so what he then did, and you can't hardly believe it until you hear that he did it, and he did actually do it, he surrendered himself to the English again. He went back to England. And he dies in London in 1364. And so it just, it's one of those sort of weird aspects of this, where you're having a war where the old feudal model of warfare is not working, but the values are still in play. And so you'll see people still conduct themselves according to that in some cases. The war dies down for a few years, and then finally there's a renewal of it, a phase of it that lasts from about 1370 until 1375. And people studying this part of the war generally can see that it's just plain weird, basically. It's peculiar. You have continued chevauchés. The English continue to go over and raid. But at this point, there's a new king on the throne. The successor, Charles V, also known as Charles the Wise. He was much more intelligent than his predecessors, and he was determined to regain what had been lost to the English in the Treaty of Bretigny. And he was a patient man, and he was smart enough to realize that there's a need to abandon some of the traditional methods of warfare. He begins to bring into his service these French captains, these people who are used to fighting, able to fight war in a slightly different way. The one that we'll mention is the most famous one, Bertrand du Guesclin. He was a minor Breton knight And Charles elevated him to become his military chief. He becomes Constable of France, which is the chief military official in France. And one thing we'll say about old Bertie, he was not a gentleman. He didn't buy into the chivalric model of warfare. Not at all. He was willing to abandon chivalry in favor of unconventional tactics. And he was very happy to use mercenaries instead of knights. He felt that they were more effective and they would actually do what you asked them to do. And so again, you see this breaking down of the old model and shifting to a new type of warfare. Basically, during this 5-year period, what these French captains did, and Bertrand chief among them, they avoided set battles with the English because those had not been working out. They had gotten their butt kicks at Crécy and Poitiers. They weren't going to do that again if they could avoid it. And they engaged in guerrilla warfare, which you're probably familiar with. It's this notion of hit and run tactics. Do not engage your enemy directly. Use stratagems. Use whatever you can to reduce your enemy and wear the enemy out. It becomes kind of a war of attrition type thing in that respect. What these captains would do, if they came up across the English stronghold in these areas held by the English, they would try to bribe the guards to let them in, rather than try to fight directly or engage in conventional siege warfare outside of a strong point. Very frequently, actually, what they apparently would do is that if you had an English-held castle and there's a little town nearby, they would go into the town, they would round up all the prostitutes and hire them and persuade them to go offer their services gratis to the English, to the guards at an English garrison and distract the guards and get in that way. Sometimes they would engage in what would be accounted surprise attacks, where they would just run at a stronghold and basically vault over the wall rather than trying to climb up the side and fight it conventionally. They did all kinds of crap like this, apparently. And what it meant is that by engaging in unconventional tactics, they were able to reduce English strongholds during this period one by one. Perhaps my favorite story from this period, actually, involves Louis, Duke of Bourbon, who actually, although he has a noble title, he's not averse to engaging in various sort of unconventional tactics. Although this is a fairly conventional story I'm going to tell you. As the account runs, basically Louis was besieging a castle held by an English captain. And what they decided to do, the French, outside the castle, is they would engage in mining. And that's where you begin to dig a tunnel. And the idea is to extend your tunnel enough that you can get beneath the castle walls and eventually come up within the castle and surprise your opponent. You want to try to do it as surreptitiously as possible, but the idea is to get in that way. Well, as it turned out, the English realized that the French were engaging in mining. And so what they decided to do was countermine. If the French are going to try to come up inside the castle, they're going to try to mine out and come up inside the French and surprise them that way. So it's an idea you're going to have two surprise attacks. And lo and behold, the strangest thing happened. As the two forces were mining, their minds met. They ran into each other, and they weren't quite certain what to do. They were in somewhat of a quandary. And so what eventually apparently happened is that the English captain and Louis, and the English captain didn't even know who Louis was. He knew there was some French guy out there mining. They decide to meet in the tunnel and chat with each other. And it turns into a little bit of a fight. The tunnel's so low that they can't stand up. And so what they end up doing is they start poking their swords at one another, lying down in the tunnel. And as this is going on, and they seem to be having kind of a good time at it. They're sort of enjoying what they're doing. Louis of Bourbon yells his battle cry. And these things are unique. You know, you have to have your own little cry so you can be recognized on the battlefield. The English captain hears it and realizes, hey, you're Louis, Duke of Bourbon. He said, yes, I am. I am, in fact, Louis, Duke of Bourbon. He says, I'm honored. I'm absolutely honored that we're down here jabbing at each other with swords in this tunnel. And they get to talking. And by this point, they decide, well, maybe we can sort this out. Maybe we can arrange this. And the captain makes Louis an offer that Louis couldn't refuse. Basically, what the captain offered Louis, look, he said, Louis, if you agree to knight me and let my guys ride off, I'll let you have the castle. And Louis says, yeah, works for me. I can do that. That's an honorable way to end this. But he says, this is so much fun. This little thing we're doing in the tunnel, we can't keep it all to ourselves. And so what they allowed the English and the French to do is to basically line up and go down into the tunnels one by one and jab at each other in the tunnels. And once it was all over, there was a surrender of the castle. They had a ceremony where Louis knighted the English captain and made him a knight. They exchanged gifts and the English ride off. And the castle was reduced. And it tells you that things are becoming very strange, kind of surreal, certainly very unconventional during certain phases of the war. And this apparently did in fact happen. And so what happens over the course of time is Charles V has quite a bit of success. By 1374, the English had only what they had held at the beginning of the war plus Calais. And so they'd gotten it all back that had been granted in the Treaty of Bretigny. And the fighting ceases in 1375. Most of the major players are in fact dead within a few years. And so by 1396, things are so quiet that there's the arrangement of a 20-year truce. And so you've entered into this, again, another very lengthy, quiet phase of the war. And you begin to wonder, why is this even going to start again at this point? It seems like it's ended up after the first, how many years is it, 60 years of conflict, that they're more or less where they were at the beginning with the English holding Gascony. The only difference, they hold a little bit of Calais now, too. So it's, it seems like a lot of action for nothing. But this leads us to the second part of the war, the 15th century phase. And we'll try to get through this as efficiently as possible. We're going to wind this down. What renews the conflict? Well, the renewal of the conflict is due to Henry V, the English king. There are various visual images of Henry V that we modern folks have because of the cinema. My mother-in-law, who's resting comfortably in seclusion in her nursing home in Palo Alto, her image was Sir Laurence Olivier, who did a cinematic version of the Shakespeare play eons ago, and she thinks it's the definitive image and version of it. She can't be moved off of that. I watched it and I thought it was good, but I actually preferred the more recent one. And I guess it's because of different movie sensibilities across generations. The image that we have is of Kenneth Branagh. For you Harry Potter fans, he's Gilderoy Lockhart in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. He made, early in his filmmaking career, a version of Henry V, the Shakespeare play, a cinematic version. And if you get a chance, take a look at it. I placed it on the syllabus, and I'm not, as we're winding down to the end, I'm not going to be a bear about enforcing this, but I have put up a discussion board for it. And so if you feel like you want to add to your discussion, that's a very easy way to do it. And I think you would enjoy the film. It's always good to see a little Shakespeare. And one thing about Shakespeare, the histories, they're not history in any absolute sense, but he actually, whenever he depicts certain political events, he almost always has some sort of source material that he's using for it. And so these things are always useful to see how somebody in his time, the late 16th, early 17th century, processed history according to the histories that were available to him at the time, and then dramatized them. But anyway, what can we say about Henry V? By all accounts, he's a personally unpleasant person. He loved war and he lusted for power. Those were his major qualities. And he also discovered that war is a really good way to keep the English barons busy. It keeps them happy, basically, and distracts them. And he also wanted to gain even greater legitimacy for his claim to the throne, because at this point, of course, by this point, you'd had a bit of a shift of dynasty. We didn't go into the politics of it in this class. But there had been a change after the reign of Richard II, and so he wants to further legitimize his own rule, and he sees warfare as an avenue to do that. And so what he does to further legitimize himself is he renews the claim to the French crown. He sees this as a worthwhile project from all of these perspectives. And it was an opportune time for him to attack France. The reason for that being is that the French king, by this point Charles VI, he's beginning to have episodes of insanity where he slips in and out, basically. He has lucid periods, but there are periods when he is nuttier than a loon, basically. And these bouts of insanity begin in 1392. There are periods when he's in confinement, that he can't be let out in public because of all the problems that he's having. He has a serious mental health issue. And there are struggles within his family regarding who should serve as the regent during these periods when the king is indisposed. And so this is a very good time for Henry V of England to cause some problems. And these problems eventually culminate in the third big set battle of the war, Agincourt. Basically, the situation was this: Henry crosses to Normandy with an army. It's about 2,000 men at arms and about 6,000 archers, in a fairly small force. They reduced the castle at Harfleur. Actually, if you watch the movie, the Henry V movie, you get to see the siege of Harfleur very early on, and it's part of the Shakespeare play. And so they have reduced a castle in Normandy, but then his army is struck by dysentery. Basically, they begin to dehydrate badly. This happens during this period. The battle, the siege, plus the dysentery reduces this army down to about 6,000 men. Henry realizes that it would probably be a good time to get out of Dodge, to get back to England. What he wants to do is to go from Normandy up to Calais, where he would have the easiest crossing. But as he begins to make this dash for Calais with this weakened army, he begins to have supply problems, and it begins to rain. And so they're slogging through the mud. And if you can imagine this, undersupplied, crapping into your armory because of the dysentery, wet and muddy. It doesn't get much more miserable than this. It reaches a point where he's too weak really to flee the French. And interesting thing, well, if you're an English king and you've learned something from the 14th century encounters in the French, and you realize you have to fight, what would you do? Well, you might look around and say, is there any high ground around here anywhere? Yeah, seems to be. He finds some acceptable ground near a little French town called Agincourt. And what to say, in terms of the outcome of the battle, as far as military historians understand it, it's virtually a carbon copy, a Xerox copy to Poitiers. You have the French nobles turned into pincushions. Many of them are taken prisoner if they aren't killed. And so you have another semi-decimation of the French nobility, still fighting by the chivalric model, essentially. The battle culminates ultimately 5 years later in this thing called the Treaty of Troyes. And the treaty is amazing when you think about it. The French Dauphin in this treaty is disinherited. He is no longer the heir to the throne of France. Henry is to marry Catherine, the daughter of the mad King Charles VI. If you need a mental image, it is Emma Thompson, who for a time was married to Kenneth Branagh. She is the Catherine that appears in his movie version of this. She also appears in the Harry Potter movies. She's the kind of wacky professor who tries to tell people how to do divination, to predict the future using tea leaves and stuff like that, crystal balls and all that nonsense. So that's Emma Thompson. Henry then was to become King of France on the death of Charles. In other words, you had a situation by treaty where the English king was supposed to finally become the King of France to complete the project. However, an interesting thing happens. You have the treaty, and 2 years later, both Henry and Charles die. And so the crowns, both of them, pass to Henry's infant son, the future Henry V. Just a very small child at this point. Remember, he'd only married Catherine in 1420, so you have the toddler, essentially an infant, who's supposed to become king, which means that you have to set up some sort of arrangement in the meantime to rule France until this infant comes of age to rule himself. What they do is they divide France basically into three portions. The Dauphin and some regents, the regents for the young infant Henry, run one part of it. John, Duke of Bedford, and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the two brothers of Henry V, run the other two bits. And so this is basically how France is divided up during this period, during this type of regency. And to tell you the truth, things aren't looking too good for the French. The assumption seems to be that the King of England is going to continue to be the King of France, as it has worked out. But it's at this juncture an amazing thing happens. And this is the principal reason why people study this part of the war in some respects. The French have suffered a series of defeats and continue to suffer defeats as time goes on. And it's right at this point that you have the appearance of this peasant girl from Domremy, this peasant girl named Joan. This area where she grew up, it had suffered heavily at the hands of the English. because during this period, the English can do pretty much whatever they damn well please in terms of raiding and that sort of thing. And the hatred for the English in this area of France was intense. This was the environment in which young Joan grew up. And Joan is a very unconventional person. She has visions. And in these visions, she claims that Saints Michael, Catherine, and Margaret told her of the pitiful state of France repeatedly, and they told her to go to the aid of the King of France, who wouldn't have been the King of France at that point. It would have been a Dauphin from her perspective, this crown prince who had been disinherited in this treaty. The voices tell her to save France, and so she's hearing voices, according to the accounts we have. She seeks out a local French captain because of this, and she demands to see the king, or the Dauphin actually at this point. And she's eventually taken to him. It's during this period in 1429 that the city of Orleans is under siege by the English. And as far as we can tell what happened, she does get access to the Dauphin, and she tells him something that gave him great hope, that begins to buck up his spirit during this very bad stretch. Still, the French were somewhat leery of a girl who was hearing voices, and they had Joan examined to confirm her virginity to prove that she wasn't a witch. So they were suspicious of her. But once they had done this, they make a decision that things couldn't get much worse, so the Dauphin Charles decides to give her a chance. And Joan, with a boy's haircut and boy's clothing, rode among the men and inspired them. And the siege of Orleans was broken within a week. And so what she managed to do was stiffen the spines of the French. And they have a military success. And in the wake of this, Charles begins to push back against the English army pretty effectively. Within a few weeks, he clears the Loire Valley of the English. And Joan helped Charles fight his way all the way to Reims, where in that city he was crowned Charles VII in 1429. And so she had basically led to a great military success for the French against the English. Charles wanted to take his time at this point. That things had gone well, and he wanted, in a more gradual way, to continue to push. But Joan was impatient for a sort of absolute victory. And it's at this point, after this initial success, that Charles begins to distance himself from her. And in 1430, she is captured by the Burgundians. And as we mentioned, the Dukes of Burgundy tend to favor the English in these conflicts. Charles refused to ransom her. He kind of left her hanging out to dry, so the Burgundians then sell her to the English. And what the English want to do, they had witnessed this, they knew all about it, obviously. They wanted to destroy French morale by proving that she was a heretic, that she was somehow in league with dark forces, that you couldn't trust this woman, and that what she had accomplished with the aid of dark powers. So she's tried as a witch in a show trial at Rouen by the English. And you have accounts of this in the Reader that I put together for you, about Joan of Arc generally, and also about this trial. You have a bit of the trial transcript there. Joan was illiterate, but she was craftier than the English had expected. And she didn't fall into the legal trap set for her. She may not have been able to read, but she was intelligent. And what eventually happens to her is that they just, as often happens in these prosecutions for heresy and witchcraft, they just wore her down. And eventually, physical exhaustion led her to confess. But when she was arrested again, she retracted her confession. And this was problematic because once you had made a confession and then retract it, well, let me put it this way. Basically, where witchcraft, in terms of the large box it falls into in the medieval mind, witchcraft is heresy. And we haven't really talked about heresy much in the course, but it is accepted in belief that is not deemed orthodox by the church. And so by acknowledging that she was a witch, initially she had acknowledged that she was a heretic. By then recanting that confession, she becomes a relapsed heretic. And that allows then a sentence of death to be imposed upon her as a relapsed heretic. And she was burned at Rouen in 1431. And so she comes to a bad end. Joan has been a figure of consistent fascination by lots of people for lots of reasons. Not only among scholars, they continue to fascinate her, but also cinematically, she's been a fascinating figure. She's appeared in movie treatments a lot. One of my personal favorites, and this probably doesn't surprise you, is the version of it where the actress is actually Jane Wiedlin, who was better known as a guitarist and vocalist for the band the Go-Go's back in the 80s and early 90s. She appears as Joan of Arc in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, the initial Bill and Ted film. And I should note that there apparently has been filmed and was supposed to be released this summer, the third Bill and Ted movie where they bring the actors back, practically 30 years later after the initial movie. Maybe Jane Wiedlin will be in this. Maybe she'll take another turn as Joan of Arc. It's the funniest thing. At one point, you see her on the cover of something called Teen Martyr magazine in a in a magazine stand in one scene in the movie. So you have that as one of my personal favorite depictions of Joan of Arc, just because it's so tongue-in-cheek and fun. You had Milla Jovovich more recently in a film called The Messenger, Lily Sobieski in a film called Joan of Arc. Those are more recent treatments of her. Classic treatments, Ingrid Bergman, the wonderful, amazing Ingrid Bergman in a film called Joan of Arc, and the equally fantastic Jean Seberg as Saint Joan in another earlier movie treatment of her. And so she's had this fascination cinematically and also for historians and scholars. Obviously, from certain perspectives, she is viewed as a feminist icon, and there's just been a raft of scholarship about Joan. But the point is that burning her didn't do the English any good. You see a reduction of the English-held towns one by one over the next 2 decades. And by 1453, the concluding year of the war, the English had lost all possessions in France except for the port town of Calais, which they continued to hold for some time after this, for a couple of centuries. But this is how the thing totally winds down. And this leads us finally to address the issue of the consequences of the war. What came out of it? Well, as you've probably already gathered, it marked the end of the feudal model of warfare. And we should reiterate, the rank and file becomes more important in the conclusion of battles, and you have the use of hired professionals, and eventually in France you have the creation in the latter phases of the war of a professional standing army, the sort of army that we would recognize, where you have an army that's there all the time, and the men who are in it are actually paid to be professional soldiers full time. And so that's what they have put together. And this is where you're moving into a more modern way of thinking about warfare and thinking about armies. So you have a shifting model of warfare. You also have the war as a huge economic drain. It led to a lot of destruction of France, obviously. It disrupted trade, and you can say with fair certainty that both participants were less wealthy by the end of the war. It drained them both. Obviously, the English did better because they're able to take stuff with them and benefit from being in France, but they both suffered ultimately as a consequence of it. In the terms of England, the place we're most concerned with, it leads to a period of local disorder and the growth of representative institutions, two kind of related phenomena. Basically, it meant this war that local leaders would be out of the country a lot during the course of the war, during the periods of major battles, and also for the chevauchés. And once they return to England, England falls into almost immediate political disorder. It's no coincidence that the 100 Years' War ends in 1453. In 1455, 2 years later, you have the beginning of this thing called the Wars of the Roses, the dynastic war fought in England that goes on for about 30 years, with some little pauses in it, down to 1485. If we had all the time in the world, I would have concluded the course with this, but I never seem to get to it for one reason or another. I should note parenthetically, for those of you who are Game of Thrones fans, the period of English history that sort of television masterpiece, and I love it actually. I just completed the last season of it this spring because there was a project I had to complete, this editing project, and I swore to myself I wouldn't look at the last season of Game of Thrones until I completed the editing project. Once that was completed, I actually watched it. And I will tell you, I liked the way it ended. I thought it was just perfect. I don't know what people were upset about it. It made perfect sense to me as I watched the ending of it. But the point here, the War of the Roses is most often associated with Game of Thrones in terms of material representation and the notion of complex dynastic conflict. Because it was basically a dynastic conflict between two competing houses for who had the legitimate claim to control the whole ball of wax in England. And what emerges from it is eventually the emergence of this House of Tudor, which begins to lead you into Tudor Stuart England and early modern England. So you have this civil disorder in England in the wake of it as all the nobles come home, and you have this dynastic conflict. What also emerges from the war from the English perspective is a great strengthening of representative institutions, because parliaments were called frequently, because this war was expensive. To go over to France in these amphibious expeditions, you got to cross over and take your army with you. There was a frequent calling of Parliament to ask for extraordinary taxation, to ask for money. And what the parliamentarians come to realize is that you should not give it easily. That if you have grievances, this is a perfect time to have your grievances redressed by the government. And so you begin to see the king being subjected to a principle called redress before supply. If the king is to be supplied money, he must redress grievances first. And so this principle, as well as calling Parliament so frequently, leads to the strengthening of it as a representative institution. Representative governance becomes even more regularized and stronger during the course of this war. And then finally, another effect of the war that people talk about a lot is this issue of national identity. Do you see the thin end of the wedge of something called nationalism beginning to appear very early on from this conflict? What we can say in the case of France is that prior to the war, you have great French particularism. And what I mean by that, if you would talk to somebody from France, they would be less likely to identify themselves as French as being a Gascon or a Norman or being Flemish or being Burgundian or being somebody from Champagne, that this was how they tended to think about one another. This particularism begins to fade during the course of the war, and people by the end of it are probably a little bit more likely to identify themselves as French. And so you begin to head towards something like a French national identity as the war continues. This was something that had developed earlier in England, this notion of defining yourself. And it's easy to define yourself, I guess, in some respects by what you're not. If you're fighting the Welsh and the Scots, it might become a little easier to think about yourself as English, and the French fighting the English, it made it a little easier for them to identify themselves as French. But the point was, it develops a bit earlier in England, this notion of national identity. It's strengthened during the course of the war. I don't think there's any question about that. And you begin to see a clear division between England and France. And obviously, the territoriality is part of it. The English come to hold only Calais. The rest of it is held by the King of France from this point forward. And so that division becomes clearer, is clarified, and strengthened during the course of the war. And this war sets the course for future internal political development of two of Europe's most powerful monarchies. You begin to move into something that you might begin to, in a short while, identify not as feudal monarchies, but as nation states. And so you're heading into early modernity and a different way of thinking about politics. So all these things begin to work together. And the larger point here, as we wind down the course with, not so much with a bang, but maybe with a little bit of a whimper, is that you're seeing these medieval institutions being abraded and worn away and replaced by other things as you move toward the year 1500. And then as you move into the early modern period, you have the Italian Renaissance and you have the Reformation as these other movements which are going to move you into a very different sort of Europe. And so that's sort of where we've headed in this course, and you'll see the completion of that process as you move into any course that you take in Renaissance or Reformation or early modern European history. And having said that, I think I've said enough. I'm going to sign off for now. I even got this done in a reasonable amount of time, hour and a half's about right. And I'll probably videotape you another little thing to sort of completely wind up the course administratively. I hope you're having all a great day, that you're being safe, that you're coping well with the way that we're living now. I have the strong impression we're going to be still doing this for a while, despite some things you might be hearing in the news. The virus remains out there, and I do hope that you'll be very careful. Think about yourselves, take care of your own health and your own safety, and take care of your friends and family. Do the right things during the course of this. I'll probably talk to you again in a bit. Take care. I'm checking off for now. Talk to you later.